Riley Hart stepped off the gray shuttle bus with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned long ago how to move without drawing attention. The students of Military Academy rarely stopped to notice new arrivals. There were dozens each semester, but something about her made several heads lift anyway. Maybe it was the way she walked, balanced, economical, alert without seeming paranoid. Maybe it was her posture, straight but not stiff, controlled in a way that didn't match her age. Or maybe it was the fact that she carried only one small duffel, as if she had trained herself never to rely on unnecessary possessions. Her dark hair was tied into a simple low bun. Her uniform was crisp despite having been issued only that morning. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look excited. She looked prepared, fully prepared for something no one else could see. The academy grounds hummed with the usual chaos, marching units on the central field, instructors barking orders, freshmen scrambling to orient themselves, the smell of fresh-cut grass mixing with jet fuel drifting in from the nearby training airstrip. But Riley moved through it all like a ghost sliding between worlds, touching nothing, observing everything. Cadets whispered, "Who's the new girl?" No info on the roster. "She looks too old for a freshman." "No, she's just different." They were right. Riley wasn't supposed to stand out. She wanted this place to be her reset button, a fresh chapter. Military Academy was prestigious, yes, one of the country's top feeder institutions for future Army officers. But it was also strict, structured, predictable. It was exactly what she wanted. No missions, no covert directives, no sudden alarms in the middle of the night, no faces she couldn't forget no matter how hard she tried. Just school, just discipline, just normal. But normal never stayed normal for long. Her arrival did not go unnoticed by the Academy's power structure, especially not by the senior cadets who had developed a long-standing habit of asserting dominance over newcomers. Among them, the trio known as Blake, and loud, overconfident, and treated by other students like royalty, noticed Riley the moment she stepped onto campus. Blake Spencer nudged with an elbow as they watched her walk toward the barracks. "Look at that, moving like she owns the place, a freshman trying to act tough." Smirked lazily, or scared, hard to tell with those quiet types. Added a low whistle. "Watch her slip during drill, those nerves always show." But Riley didn't slip. During the afternoon physical assessment, she completed the obstacle course in silence, beating the average time by several seconds. She didn't celebrate when she reached the finish line. She didn't even breathe heavily. She simply stepped aside and waited for the others, hands behind her back. When another cadet tripped on a rope ladder, she didn't laugh. She caught him by the wrist so fast that 3 students blinked twice trying to understand how she'd moved. Then, without waiting for thanks, she returned to her place in line. Whispers grew louder. "She's trained." That wasn't luck. "Where is she from?" But no one could find anything about her. No social media, no tagged online, no previous school photos, no digital footprint at all. That alone made some cadets uneasy. People with no past were either hiding something or running from something. Blake didn't like it, not because Riley was special, but because he didn't know how to categorize her. He was used to reading people easily, the insecure ones, the arrogant ones, the ones desperate to fit in. Riley was none of those. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to survive anyone. She seemed to simply exist in a calm, centered bubble that Blake found irritating beyond reason. At lunch, Riley chose a quiet table in the corner, avoiding the noisy clusters in the center of the hall. She ate her food slowly, focusing on each bite like someone who had learned to be grateful for meals. She noticed everything: who argued, who laughed too loud, who had a habit of bullying weaker cadets, but she never reacted. When a chair accidentally got kicked into her table, causing her water to spill, Riley calmly picked up the cup, refilled it, and returned to her seat without a single glare. Blake watched it happen from across the room. "She didn't even flinch," he muttered. "That's weird," said. "Girls here usually try hard to make friends." "She's not trying at all," added. "Nobody that calmed the first day." Blake smirked. "We'll see how long that lasts." Riley heard every word, of course. She had been trained to pick up details that others missed: tone shifts, footsteps, breaths, micro-expressions. She didn't need to look at the trio to know they'd pegged her as a target. She had seen men like them before, boys who confused swagger with strength, who needed validation from each other to feel relevant. She didn't want trouble, but trouble wanted her. That evening, after lights out, she sat on her bunk journalizing quietly. Her handwriting was neat, almost military. She listed her goals for the semester: pass leadership workshops, maintain top physical scores, keep attention minimal, avoid unnecessary conflicts. Her pen hesitated. She added one more: stay invisible. But she already knew it wouldn't happen. As she closed her notebook, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Laughter, the unmistakable voices of Blake's trio. They paused outside her door before moving on. Testing boundaries, scouting, predicting. Riley exhaled slowly. She didn't want to be the center of anyone's obsession. She just wanted peace, a rare thing in her life. She hadn't come here to remember who she used to be. She had come here to forget. Yet the academy, with all its routines and discipline, reminded her too much of what she'd walked away from. The drills, the inspections, the endless emphasis on strength. It was all familiar, all echoing the world she had left behind, the world where she had been one of the Navy SEALs, youngest close-quarters combat instructors. The world she hoped would stay buried. But secrets had a way of bleeding through cracks, and the cracks had already started forming. Tomorrow would be worse, she could feel it. Sometimes the calm before the storm wasn't peace, it was the warning. And Blake and his crew, arrogant, restless, hungry for dominance, were already planning their next move, believing Riley was just another quiet girl they could intimidate. They had no idea how wrong they were. Blake Spencer prided himself on being the loudest presence in any room. Whether he was right or wrong didn't matter. What mattered was that people listened. For 3 years at Military Academy, he had built a reputation as the cadet others avoided crossing. Backed him with strategy, backed him with muscle. Together, the trio formed an unspoken hierarchy. Their approval meant protection, and their anger meant chaos. But Riley Hart didn't react to them at all. That made her a problem. Blake first noticed her calmness during the afternoon drills. He had expected a freshman girl to struggle, especially one with no social footprint, no apparent connections, and a first day filled with stares and whispers. Most freshmen tripped over the rope ladders, panicked during high-pressure runs, or at least cracked under the sergeant's booming voice. But Riley didn't. She moved as if the course were familiar, as if her body remembered each motion before she performed it. Her landing from the platform was soft and precise, her sprint steady, her grip firm. She didn't stumble, didn't gasp, didn't hesitate. Blake hated it. He thrived on predictability, on knowing people's weaknesses so he could exploit them. Riley wasn't giving him anything. No nervous smile, no timid apologies, no shaky attempts to fit in. Noticed the same thing. She didn't break a sweat, he muttered once they were back in their barracks, peeling off their training shirts. Tossed his towel aside. You saw that catch she made earlier. Kid almost smashed his wrist on the ground. She grabbed him before he even reacted. Blake snorted, probably luck. Raised an eyebrow, twice. That detail didn't escape any of them. Riley had rescued 2 cadets that day, both times with reflexes too sharp for someone supposedly untrained. That wasn't luck. That was instinct. Blake hated instinct too. The trio often spent nights planning how to maintain control over the student hierarchy. Most of the academy's social order was unofficial, driven by personality, reputation, and intimidation. Freshmen quickly learned who held power. Blake's trio maintained theirs through calculated fear. They didn't physically hurt anyone usually. They didn't need to. Their presence alone intimidated. But Riley didn't seem intimidated. Late that night, as the three of them gathered in the corner of the senior lounge, their frustration turned into a conversation that spiraled quickly. "You notice how she didn't look at us once?" asked, shuffling cards but not actually playing. "Yeah," said, leaning back, almost like she planned not to. Blake shrugged sharply. "She thinks she's better than us." Smirked. "You think that bothers her?" "She should care," Blake snapped. "Everyone else does." Exchanged a look with, "Or maybe she's just different." Blake rolled his eyes. "Don't start defending her." "I'm not," replied. "I'm just saying she's not here to stir anything." "But she already is," Blake muttered. He hated change. Riley's very existence threatened the delicate balance of ego and dominance he relied on. If someone new came in and performed better than him without even acknowledging him, what did that make him look like? Someone irrelevant. That was unacceptable. Word traveled fast across the academy, spreading in whispers. By dinner, rumors about Riley. She had prior training, she was from a military family, she'd been expelled from her last school for fighting, she'd done martial arts, she'd been in boarding schools her whole life. Everyone invented something. Riley contributed to none of it. She sat alone, unbothered, focused on the simple routine of her meal. That subtle indifference, it twisted Blake's frustration into something sharper. "Someone gotta put her in place," Blake muttered while watching Riley from across the cafeteria. Leaned forward. "We can't just confront her in daylight, too many people." "Then we do it at night," Blake replied. Frowned. "How far are you trying to go with this?" "Not far enough to get in trouble," Blake said quickly, though his tone carried an edge. "Just a lesson, a reminder of the hierarchy. If she wants to walk around like she's invisible, we'll show her she's not." Grinned. Trouble always excited him. Behind Barracks C cameras there have been broken for months. Hesitated. "You sure? She doesn't act like the usual newbies we scare." Blake waved him off. "Please, she's nothing special, just weird." But wasn't convinced. Something about Riley lingered with him, her silence, her steady eyes, her lack of fear. She wasn't the type to crumble. He felt it. Blake noticed the hesitation and smirked. "You scared?" Scowled, "Just cautious." "Well, don't be," Blake said. "We'll handle it." The plan formed quickly, propelled by ego, groupthink, and boredom. That combination at the academy often created situations that escalated beyond control. This one was no different. Suggested forging a written summons from the assistant training officer, something simple, official-looking enough to pull Riley out after hours. Blake loved the idea. He took out a blank disciplinary form from his folder, something he had stolen weeks earlier, and began writing in a careful, almost arrogant script. "Cadet Riley Hart, report to training evaluation area at 2200 hours. Location, Barracks C perimeter. Instructor L. Morse." It looked official enough. And if Riley didn't show the note to anyone, which the trio assumed, nobody would question its authenticity. When slid the finished note onto Riley's bunk while she was showering, he wore a satisfied smile. Standing guard outside the hallway still felt uneasy. "You ever feel like we're poking something we should?" he asked. Shrugged. "She's a freshman girl, man, relax." "A freshman girl." Repeated the words, but they didn't sit right. Something about Riley didn't match that label. Back in the lounge, Blake laid out the final steps. They'd gather 6 or 7 cadets, mostly those who followed their lead blindly, and wait behind Barracks C. No weapons, no real harm, just intimidation. The kind Riley supposedly deserved. "This'll send a message," Blake declared. Stared at him. "A message to who? She isn't challenging you." "That's the problem," Blake said coldly. "She doesn't care about any of us. That makes us look weak." Grinned. "Let's fix that." Blake didn't realize that strength wasn't measured by how many people feared you. Riley had learned the real meaning of strength long ago, under circumstances these cadets couldn't imagine. But Blake wasn't thinking logically. He was thinking emotionally, driven by insecurity disguised as dominance. As the trio finalized their plan, Riley sat quietly on her bunk reading the forged summons with a calm expression. She wasn't surprised. People like Blake always made the same mistake. They mistook quiet for weakness. She folded the note neatly, placed it into her journal, and prepared for the night. Trouble wasn't coming for her. She was walking straight into it. And she would handle it exactly the way she handled everything else, calmly, methodically, and without fear. Riley Hart stood at her locker staring at the forged summons for a long, quiet moment. To anyone else, the handwriting would have looked official enough. The tone, the structure, the timestamp, it all mimicked military formality. But Riley had spent enough years following real orders to know this one was fake. The alignment was wrong. The signature was stiff. And no legitimate evaluation ever happened at 2200 hours behind Barracks C, the most neglected area on campus. Still, Riley didn't tear it up. She folded the paper carefully, slid it into her journal, and sat on her bunk with an expression so serene it would have unsettled anyone watching. She knew what this was. She'd been in situations like this before, ambushes disguised as meetings, traps disguised as directives, threats disguised as tests. But those memories lived in another world, a world far from the academy where mistakes got people killed and the wrong judgment call could end a mission. Compared to that, this was something else entirely, childish, sloppy, predictable. Still dangerous, yes, but not in the way the boys thought. If they were smart, they would have picked a different target. Someone who panicked, someone who cried easily, someone desperate to fit in. But the trio had made the mistake all careless predators make. They underestimated the quiet one. As Riley fastened her boots, she took a deep breath and allowed her mind to flatten into focus. She didn't intend to hurt anyone. Hurting people had never been her goal, not even during the harshest parts of her training. But she wouldn't allow harm to come to herself either. She tucked her hair into her regulation bun, adjusted her wristbands, and headed for the door with slow, deliberate steps. Outside, the night air was colder than usual, a crisp Virginia chill that carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The campus lanterns cast long shadows across the walkways, and the rhythmic sound of drill commands echoed faintly from cadets finishing late-night runs on the main field. She moved silently between buildings, nodding each sound, each shift in the air, each flicker of light. Riley had always found comfort in nights like this, quiet, expectant, filled with secrets the dark held onto tightly. Behind Barracks C, things were different. There were no lights, no cameras. The command staff had submitted requests for repairs months ago, but budget delays kept the area untouched. Cadets joked that the place had been forgotten by time itself. It hadn't been forgotten tonight. Riley arrived precisely at 21:59. Punctuality, she'd learned, was as much a shield as it was a habit. She stood in the shadows, leaning against the cold brick wall, waiting. At 22:03, she heard footsteps. 7 sets. Too loud, too confident, too careless. She didn't move when Blake and his group emerged from the far end of the alley. She didn't raise her hands or widen her stance. She simply watched, breathing slowly, observing, calculating. Blake stepped forward wearing a smug grin that tried too hard to look intimidating. His posture screamed arrogance. His eyes screamed insecurity. "Well, well," he said, flicking a smirk at the others. "She actually came." Riley tilted her head slightly. "I was summoned." The simplicity of her answer irritated Blake. He expected fear, excuses, or at least confusion. Her calmness forced him to work harder to maintain control. Behind him, crossed his arms with a swagger he didn't fully own. Lingered near the back, less confident than usual, eyes flicking to Riley with an uneasiness he tried to hide. 2 younger cadets, First-year boys looking to impress, close the circle from behind. If they realized what they were participating in, their faces didn't show it. They were too intoxicated by belonging to the senior trio's world. "You know," Blake said, stepping closer, "you've been walking around like you're better than everyone." Riley blinked once. "I haven't spoken to anyone." "Exactly," snapped, "acting like you're too good for us." Riley remained quiet. Sometimes silence revealed more than arguments ever did. "Kicked an empty can out of the way. You didn't even look at us on day one." "That's what this is," Riley asked softly. "I didn't look at you." Blake stepped closer, invading her space in a way he must have assumed would intimidate her. "Don't get smart. You're new, fresh. You don't just come here and ignore the people who run this place." Riley studied him with a neutral expression, soft voice, even tone. "No one runs this place, that's why we have commanders." Blake's jaw clenched. "Cute, you think you're tough." "No," Riley shifted her weight as a distant plane passed overhead. "I just think you're doing something you'll regret." The alley fell silent. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. And that made it worse. Took a step forward. "Let's teach her some respect." Riley exhaled. She knew they were going to move. All she needed to determine was when and how. Their body language made it clear. Shoulders tightening, feet shifting, breath shortening. They weren't coordinated fighters, they were impulsive ones. Blake cracked his knuckles. "Last chance, Riley. You apologize for your attitude or—" "I don't have an attitude," she said calmly. "You have an assumption." He blinked twice. Her composure unsettled him more than a shout ever could. Behind him raised a hand hesitantly. "Blake, maybe we should just—" "No," Blake barked. "She needs to learn." Riley watched the trio with a sadness she couldn't hide. She had met many people who believed power came from numbers, from noise, or from standing in dark alleys pretending to be dangerous. But real power was quiet, steady, controlled. They had no idea what real power looked like. She straightened slightly. "I'll say this one more time," she murmured. "You don't want to do this." Blake snorted. "Wrong answer." He stepped back, cracked his neck, and nodded at the others. That was the moment Riley felt the shift, the careless surge of adrenaline in their movements, the tightening of shoulders, the subtle repositioning of feet. The moment just before chaos. Riley inhaled deeply and let the air settle within her. She didn't raise her fists. She didn't widen her stance. She didn't prepare to attack. She prepared to protect herself and them. Because she knew once the first strike came, everything would spiral into something none of them were ready for. And as Blake lunged forward, reckless, angry, completely unaware, Riley didn't think about winning. She thought about minimizing injury. To them, not to her. Blake's fist cut through the dim alley air, swinging recklessly at Riley's head. Time slowed in the corner of her mind as she shifted her weight slightly, her feet gliding across the gravel with precise balance. The punch never connected. Instead, it brushed past her shoulder, and Blake's momentum carried him forward, tripping over the uneven ground and slamming onto the dirt with a thud that echoed across the walls. The other cadets froze. Not out of fear, they had expected some resistance, but because the motion, the precision, and the calmness of Riley's dodge didn't look human. "Whoa," muttered, his hand still midair from a gesture he had made while laughing moments before. He stepped forward, thinking he could overwhelm her with sheer force and numbers. Riley didn't flinch. Her body moved in a controlled rhythm, redirecting each charge, each shove, each reckless swing. She didn't punch back. She didn't scream. She simply guided their energy against itself. One cadet's momentum sent him stumbling into another. One grabbed at her wrist and she twisted gently, and suddenly he was on his knees, staring at the ground, unsure of what just happened. She was not fighting. She was untouchable. Positioned at the rear, tried to circle her, hopping to corner her. He lunged with an elbow aimed at her ribs, confident that speed alone would force her to react. But Riley pivoted almost lazily, redirecting his elbow sideways and tripping him onto the wet grass. His shoulder hit the ground with a dull thud, and he yelped in pain. Blake scrambled to his feet, rage building in his chest. "Enough," he shouted. "You little." Riley's eyes, calm and measured, met his. "Enough what?" she asked softly. The subtle tone, gentle, almost conversational, slammed into Blake like a hammer. He had expected insults, tears, panic, fear. He had expected someone desperate to save face. But she was none of those things. She's not human," whispered one of the younger cadets who had been following the trio blindly. "You're underestimating her," Riley said calmly, reading every movement, every microshift in balance, every subtle surge of adrenaline in the air. "One more step and someone gets hurt, and I don't want that." Gritted his teeth and charged, hopping to catch her off guard. But Riley's movement was too fluid, too practiced. She grabbed his wrist mid-swing and gently twisted, forcing him to drop forward onto his hands. He stumbled, disoriented, trying to maintain balance, realizing in that instant that his strength meant nothing without control. Blake's jaw tightened. He had trained other cadets before, had sparred countless times, and yet here in this alley he was helpless. Every move he attempted was met with counterforce that seemed effortless. It wasn't brute strength. It was skill, precision, and control that none of them had ever seen. Riley's calmness became a weapon, not because she attacked, but because she didn't need to. Every motion she made was designed to neutralize the aggression without escalating it. Tried again, this time attempting a low sweep aimed at her legs. Riley leapt slightly, letting the momentum carry him forward instead. His knees hit the ground with a dull thud. By now, panic was rising in the group. What they had expected, a quick scare, a demonstration of dominance, was dissolving into confusion and fear. The calculated arrogance that had guided them now seemed flimsy and worthless. Blake swallowed, his anger turning into shock. He lunged for Riley, thinking sheer force would finally overwhelm her, but she pivoted so seamlessly he barely felt the movement. Her hands guided his momentum, and suddenly he was falling into the wall, hitting it lightly with his shoulder. He staggered backward, struggling to comprehend what was happening. "There, I don't understand," one of the first years whispered, his voice trembled. "Focus on restraint," Riley said, almost softly to herself. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had learned long ago that restraint was the key to mastery. Every push, every twist, every defensive maneuver was executed with precision, purpose, and control. She didn't want to hurt them, but she would defend herself with surgical efficiency if necessary. Blake grabbed a stray metal pipe from the ground, swinging it with reckless abandon. Riley's eyes flicked to it and back, assessing, calculating. A single motion of her wrist, a subtle step, and the pipe slipped from his grasp, spinning across the gravel. Blake's eyes widened, realizing the tools he thought would give him leverage meant nothing. The alley echoed with the sounds of scuffling, groans, and sudden silence, as the cadets realized they weren't just losing. They were being exposed as inexperienced, undisciplined, and completely outclassed. Finally, Riley stepped back, letting them catch their breath. No one had been seriously injured, but the humiliation, the sudden shock, and the panic hung in the air like fog. Breathing steadily, Riley said, "I warned you." The words weren't loud. They didn't carry threat or malice, but they resonated with authority far beyond any yelling, shoving, or aggression Blake had ever experienced. Blake's face went pale. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, were now wide with realization. Staggered, trying to regain composure, rubbed his knees, muttering under his breath. The younger cadet stood frozen, staring at Riley, unsure whether to flee or faint. Riley didn't gloat, she didn't smile, she didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, composed, controlled, and entirely untouchable. And for the first time that night, the power dynamics were reversed. The cadets who had planned this encounter thought they were in control. They thought intimidation would work. They thought their numbers and aggression would overwhelm her. They had underestimated her. A faint moonlight revealed a small portion of a faded golden trident tattoo peeking from her sleeve as she adjusted her arm. No one noticed it yet, but it was a symbol only a few in the world had earned, the Navy SEAL insignia. That symbol, combined with her movements, would soon speak louder than anything else. For now, the cadets were left in shock, bruised egos hanging in the air alongside the tension that they hadn't anticipated. Riley didn't need to attack. She hadn't even raised her fists. And yet, in less than 5 minutes, she had turned the alley into a classroom of her own design. The realization settled in slowly. They hadn't just failed, they had provoked someone far beyond their comprehension, and the night wasn't over. The storm, it seemed, had only just begun. The alley fell silent, save for the distant hum of night insects and the faint rustle of leaves in the cold Virginia breeze. Riley's heart stood still, breathing evenly, watching the group of 7 cadets who had tried to corner her only minutes earlier. Their aggression had dissolved into confusion and raw, disbelieving panic. They were bruised, humiliated, and utterly unprepared for what they had just experienced. Blake's chest heaved, a mix of anger and disbelief making each breath audible. "What, how?" he stammered, his voice cracking. You're not supposed to." Riley tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes calm, assessing. She had long ago learned that words were often more powerful than force, but sometimes letting silence speak was more effective. Tonight, silence had worked perfectly. Their arrogance, their impulsiveness, their complete misunderstanding of who they faced, it had unraveled in under 5 minutes. Still kneeling on the ground from the last maneuver, rubbed his wrists and muttered, This isn't normal." His eyes darted from Riley's composed stance to the slight glimpse of something he hadn't noticed before, a faint, partially exposed tattoo just above her sleeve, shimmering in the faint moonlight. Gold, sharp lines forming a trident. The moment's gaze registered it, his face went pale. "No, it can't be," he whispered. Froze mid-step, crouched in pain from his bruised shoulder, and stared at Riley as though the air around her had suddenly thickened. The pieces clicked together in a horrifying pattern, reflexes too fast, precision too exact, calmness unshakable. Every movement she had made, the redirection, the leverage, the gentle but inescapable control, was not the work of a normal cadet. This wasn't martial arts, boxing, or any school-level combat training. This was military-grade close-quarters combat. Tactical efficiency measured in milliseconds, executed with flawless discipline. Blake stumbled backward, the realization dawning too slowly, too painfully. You're, he muttered, unable to finish the sentence. Riley stepped forward slightly, letting the faint sleeve lift just a little more. The golden trident tattoo, the insignia of Navy SEAL Special Warfare, was now fully visible, its sharp lines glinting faintly under the alley's dim moonlight. A symbol only elite operatives earned, a symbol representing rigorous, near-impossible selection, brutal training, and countless combat missions. Very few women in history had ever achieved it, and she had. His jaw dropped, his face turned ashen. Even Blake, in the midst of his blustering bravado, faltered. They weren't just cornering a freshman girl. They had stumbled into someone whose life had been forged under circumstances far beyond their imagination. Someone who had taught other SEALs to survive, fight, and dominate with precision. Riley's voice was calm, measured, and piercing. "Do you understand now?" she asked softly. "You weren't cornering a freshman. You cornered someone who has been in situations far worse than a high school alley with far worse consequences." The alley seemed to shrink around them. The shadows deepened, as if recoiling from her presence. Every cadet instinctively stepped back, their bravado evaporating into something heavier, fear mixed with awe and a grudging respect that they hadn't yet fully processed. Blake, scrambling to regain a shred of composure, finally muttered, You were in the SEALs." His voice was sharp, almost a question, almost a plea. Riley's lips barely moved. "I was." Then, quieter, almost reflective, I taught combat tactics to operatives younger than some of you, in environments you can't even imagine. Every strike, every redirection tonight was designed to control, not to destroy. The younger cadets exchanged terrified glances. What they had assumed would be a simple intimidation game had become something much darker in their minds. The realization hit them slowly. This wasn't a rookie mistake. This was survival training applied in real life. Blake's knees nearly buckled. We didn't know," he said, the words faltering against the weight of shame and shock. "We thought." "You assumed," Riley interrupted softly. "And that assumption nearly got you seriously hurt. Not by malice, but by skill, by experience, by discipline. You have no idea what it's like to train, to fight, to survive with your life on the line." The young cadet nearest her, wide-eyed and shaking, whispered, We were wrong. We didn't know." Riley nodded slightly. "Now you do, and I suggest you remember it." Rubbing his bruised shoulder, let out a shaky breath. We underestimated you." "Yes," Riley said calmly. "You did, and underestimating people you can't predict is dangerous." Finally looked up, eyes wide, voice low. You didn't have to," his words trailed off. He gestured at the scattered cadets, all visibly shaken. "You didn't even hurt anyone." Riley's expression softened slightly. "I never wanted to. My point was never to destroy, but to teach, to demonstrate consequences. I've faced far worse threats in my life. You weren't that. But reckless decisions have the same effect here as they do anywhere else." Blake's hands trembled slightly. Pride, anger, and confusion battled in his chest. Finally, he said, voice cracking, "So we just walked into this." "Yes," Riley said simply, "and now you know." Her calm, measured tone carried authority that no raised voice or intimidation ever could. It was quiet power, the kind earned only through extreme discipline and experience. The cadets could feel it reverberate in their bones. For a long moment, no one spoke. The alley was heavy with silence, the kind that forced introspection. The younger cadets avoided looking directly at her, as though her presence alone was a reminder of how outclassed they were. Blake, and struggled to hold on to even a fraction of their former arrogance. Finally, Riley exhaled and stepped back, allowing the cadets space. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, she didn't threaten further. She simply walked a step toward the alley's exit, still calm, still composed, still untouchable. And as she disappeared into the shadows, the cadets were left with the truth they had been blind to until now. They had confronted a SEAL combat ace, a person trained to survive and dominate under conditions far beyond their comprehension, and had emerged only slightly unscathed thanks to restraint and luck. The alley seemed larger now, emptier, filled with the echo of their mistakes. Pride, arrogance, and ego, the tools they had relied on, had failed them completely. Blake's voice finally broke the silence. We can't tell anyone about this," he muttered. "They won't believe us." Nodded slowly, still shaking. "No one's gonna believe a bunch of cadets tried to corner a SEAL and lived." Simply muttered, almost inaudible. We've been taught a lesson we can't forget." Riley had left them alive, yes, but the lesson lingered like a shadow. It wasn't about fear. It wasn't about punishment. It was about recognition, the recognition that power, control, and experience could not be faked, bullied, or intimidated. They had met real strength that night, and they had underestimated it. By morning, the alley incident had already begun to ripple through military academy. Cadets whispered in hushed tones, gathering in small circles, repeating fragmented accounts. The new girl, the quiet one, had faced down Blake and their followers without even raising her voice. No punches had landed. No bones were broken. Yet every cadet present or who had heard the story felt the weight of what had happened. Riley, meanwhile, moved through the morning routines with her usual calm. Breakfast, drills, inspections, nothing was different for her. She didn't flaunt her skill or her victory. She didn't seek attention. She simply followed the schedule, disciplined, professional, untouchable. But the academy had noticed. The instructors and command staff summoned Blake, and for questioning. Their initial arrogance cracked the moment they were confronted with their own account, repeated back to them by witnesses. The cadets' faces grew pale as the instructor's eyes drilled into them, silent judgment heavier than any punishment could convey. "Describe what happened," one senior instructor said, his voice calm but firm, "and make no excuses." The trio stumbled over their words, the memory of Riley's composure haunting them. They tried to explain, but every word sounded weaker than the one before. They were forced to admit, reluctantly and uncomfortably, that Riley had neutralized them without causing serious harm, something none of them had expected from a freshman cadet. Worse, she had done it with unmatched precision and discipline. By noon, word of the confrontation spread further. Rumors, half-truths, and embellishments ran rampant. Some cadets speculated that Riley had prior military experience. Others guessed martial arts training. A few, daring ones whispered, "She's a SEAL." No one questioned it. Not really. The calm authority with which Riley had handled 7 aggressive cadets left too strong an impression. Even those who hadn't seen her in the alley could sense the aura of controlled power. Blake and became shadows of themselves for the rest of the morning. Their usual confidence, their easy dominance over other students had evaporated. Cadets no longer avoided Riley. They watched her with something new, respect mixed with cautious awe. The academy's command staff, however, saw beyond the gossip. They saw a student capable of extraordinary skill and discipline. While Riley had acted within reason, the potential for leadership and instruction was undeniable. By mid-afternoon, she was quietly called into the office of the academy commander. "Cadet Hart," the commander said, motioning for her to sit, "I've received reports about last night's incident." Riley nodded. She expected a discussion, perhaps a reprimand for being involved in a confrontation. She did not expect what came next. "You demonstrated remarkable restraint," the commander continued. "Most cadets would have reacted with aggression. Most would have escalated the situation. You did not. Your control, discipline, and strategic thinking under pressure are exemplary. I want you to know your skills are recognized, and that they can serve the academy beyond what the standard curriculum provides." Riley's expression remained neutral. "Thank you, sir," she said. "I don't seek recognition. I just wanted the situation to end safely." The commander nodded. "Understood. But the truth is, your peers and even some staff could benefit from learning from you. I would like you to assist in developing and teaching advanced close-quarters combat techniques. Voluntary, yes, but highly recommended." A quiet, unassuming honor rose in Riley's chest. She hadn't sought influence, but she realized she could shape the academy positively without ego or attention. She agreed simply, "I will assist." Back in the dormitory, Blake and watched her leave the office. The hallways felt different now, charged with quiet tension. Other cadets avoided eye contact with the trio or shot Riley subtle glances of admiration and awe. For the first time, the senior cadets had to experience humility, not just as an abstract concept, but as a tangible, public reality. They were forced to reflect on their behavior, to see the consequences of their arrogance. Their previous sense of invincibility, nurtured over years of unchallenged dominance, had been shattered in a single evening. By evening, Riley had begun informal instruction sessions. She didn't boast. She didn't demand attention. She simply demonstrated techniques with precise, deliberate movements, explaining leverage, positioning, timing, and the importance of discipline. Even Blake and had to attend, swallowing their pride and following her exacting standards. Her influence quickly became apparent. Cadets who had been clumsy, impulsive, or careless were now learning to anticipate movements, to control aggression, to neutralize threats without escalation. The culture of the academy, previously dominated by ego and hierarchy, began shifting toward discipline, respect, and technical mastery. Riley's philosophy was simple: power without control is useless, strength without discipline is dangerous, ego without skill is meaningless. She did not preach, she demonstrated. Cadets watched, learned, and improved. Blake's frustration grew even as he improved. Pride made every success a bitter pill, but improvement forced him to acknowledge Riley's ability. Slowly, begrudgingly, he began to understand that strength and influence were earned through restraint, not aggression. By the end of the week, the academy felt different. Cadets whispered fewer insults, pranks decreased, and drills became less about showing off and more about mastering technique. Riley's influence, though quiet, was undeniable. Even Blake, and had learned to approach her with a mixture of caution, respect, and curiosity. The lesson from the alley was no longer a single night's event. It had become a foundation for an entire culture shift. That night, Riley returned to her bunk, quietly journaling. She reflected on the events of the past 24 hours. She had arrived seeking peace, anonymity, and routine. Instead, she had inadvertently sparked a transformation within military academy. She did not regret it. Power, she understood, was not about domination. It was about the ability to control, guide, and protect. And tonight, for the first time since her arrival, she had done exactly that. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new challenges, new cadets, new egos, new tests of patience and skill. But for now, she allowed herself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. She had not sought glory. She had not sought vengeance. She had merely exercised discipline. And in doing so, she had begun to shape a culture that, until now, had lacked vision, leadership, and respect. Riley Hart had arrived at military academy hoping to escape her past. She had instead carved a path for the future. And the cadets, for all their arrogance and bluster, would never forget the lesson she taught that week. The morning after the alley incident, military academy felt different. It wasn't the facilities, the drills, or the schedule that had changed. It was the atmosphere, heavy with whispers and cautious glances. Cadets who had not witnessed the encounter heard fragmented stories from those who had. How the new girl, Riley Hart, had faced Blake, and their group without a single visible blow landing on her. The story spread like wildfire, embroidered slightly with every retelling, but the core truth remained undeniable. She had dominated them effortlessly. Riley moved through the morning routines with her usual quiet efficiency. She made her way to the mess hall, stood in line for breakfast, and took her tray without acknowledgement of the commotion around her. Her calm, steady demeanor contrasted sharply with the cadets who now eyed her cautiously from their tables. For many, it was the first time they had seen a student command attention without yelling, without posturing, and without arrogance. Blake and the self-appointed rulers of the academy's social order were noticeably subdued. Breakfast, which normally served as a stage for their loud jokes and boisterous storytelling, was quiet. Their usual swagger had been replaced with a tight-lipped tension. Every glance in Riley's direction carried an unspoken admission. She had changed the rules of the game. By mid-morning, the cadet leadership received an official notice from the academy commander requesting their presence in his office. Rumors had already reached him. When they entered, their confident expressions faltered. The commander, a tall man with an icy gaze, gestured for them to sit. "Cadets," he began, voice steady, "I have received reports regarding last night's incident behind Barracks C. According to multiple accounts, a confrontation occurred between a group of senior cadets and one of the new students, Cadet Hart. The accounts indicate that this student neutralized your group with precision, skill, and restraint. Explain yourselves." The three seniors stumbled over their words. Pride, embarrassment, and disbelief collided, creating a tangled mess of excuses. Blake tried to explain dominance, blamed impulsiveness, and muttered that it was just a mistake. Their voices faltered, broken by the silent weight of the commander's gaze. Enough, the commander said sharply. Your actions demonstrated poor judgment. You underestimated a fellow cadet, violated protocols, and exposed yourselves and others to unnecessary risk. Let this serve as a lesson. Discipline is earned through skill and control, not through arrogance or intimidation. You will submit written reflections on the incident, and I expect sincere acknowledgement of your misjudgment. The trio left the office humiliated, their usual dominance in tatters. But the real lesson extended beyond official reprimands. Across the academy, whispers carried the truth. Riley Hart was exceptional, disciplined, and untouchable. By afternoon, the ripple effects were unmistakable. Other cadets sought her out, not for confrontation but for observation. Small groups watched her movements during drills, noting how she positioned herself, controlled her momentum, and applied subtle leverage during exercises. Students who previously dismissed her presence now studied her silently, eager to learn. The academy staff recognized the potential as well. Captain, the training officer, approached Riley privately after drills. "Cadet Hart," he said, "your performance last night as well as today's exercises demonstrates skill far beyond the standard curriculum. I would like you to assist in teaching close-quarters combat techniques to selected cadets. It's voluntary, but your expertise could benefit many." Riley nodded calmly. "I will assist," she replied, her tone modest but authoritative. She did not seek recognition, but she understood the importance of guiding others safely. Word spread quickly among the cadets. By evening, she had begun informal training sessions in the courtyard, demonstrating defensive tactics, leverage, and restraint techniques. The difference between her and the others was clear. She did not rely on brute force or intimidation. She relied on precise, controlled movements that neutralized threats efficiently and safely. Even Blake and had to attend. Pride made their participation bitter, but survival instincts kept them compliant. As Riley guided them through exercises, correcting postures, demonstrating redirection, and explaining control over aggression, the trio realized the depth of their earlier misjudgment. Their egos were bruised, but they couldn't ignore the improvement that came from her instruction. The younger cadets were equally awestruck. Observing Riley's technique and composure, they quickly understood that her authority was earned through experience and skill, not loudness or fear. Her presence reshaped their understanding of hierarchy. Dominance now required discipline, not bravado. That night, the dormitory buzzed with quiet reflection. Cadets discussed the alley incident and Riley's teachings, their voices low with a mixture of respect and humility. Blake sat on the edge of their bunks, silently acknowledging her superiority without verbalizing it. They could not forget the lesson. Assumptions about weakness or fear could lead to consequences far beyond their control. Riley, meanwhile, returned to her bunk quietly. She journaled, recording the events of the day with meticulous detail. Though she had arrived at military academy seeking anonymity and routine, her presence had already begun to influence culture, discipline, and respect among the cadets. She reflected on the lessons she had imparted, not through words but through action. Strength alone was meaningless. Control without discipline was dangerous. Ego without skill was irrelevant. Through calm demonstration and measured instruction, she had shifted the academy's focus from posturing to mastery, from intimidation to competence. The cadets who had tried to challenge her learned that night, and the days that followed, that true authority was quiet, deliberate, and earned through mastery rather than fear. Even those who had once held sway over their peers recognized the power in her restraint and skill. As the lights dimmed and the dormitory settled into silence, Riley felt a rare satisfaction. She had not sought recognition, glory, or dominance. She had merely acted with discipline and foresight. Yet the effect was undeniable. The academy had already begun to change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cadets, and new opportunities to test her influence. But for now, she allowed herself a brief moment of quiet reflection. She had arrived seeking peace, and though the path had been unexpected, she had found a way to shape the environment positively without compromising her principles. Riley Hart had not only survived the night's confrontation, she had turned it into a teaching moment. And Military Academy would never be the same. Weeks passed, and Military Academy began to shift in ways no one could have anticipated. What had started as a single confrontation behind Barracks C had blossomed into a subtle revolution. Cadets walked with less bravado, drills were executed with more precision, and whispers of Riley Hart's skill, and the discipline she demanded, filled the halls. She hadn't forced the change. She had inspired it quietly through example and instruction. Riley arrived at morning drills as always, her uniform crisp, her boots polished, her eyes scanning the field with calculated focus. Blake and followed reluctantly, still holding onto fragments of pride, but each knew they had to meet her standards. Their earlier arrogance had been replaced with cautious attentiveness, their every movement measured. The younger cadets hung on Riley's every word and demonstration. She taught leverage, timing, and situational awareness. She emphasized discipline and control over brute strength, patience over impulse. Each lesson, executed with precision, reinforced a crucial truth. Real power came from mastery, not intimidation. During a grappling session, she moved beside Blake. "Keep your balance," she instructed softly. "Every movement has a purpose. Stop fighting against force. Redirect it, control it. Your ego has no place here." Blake gritted his teeth but followed her guidance. He stumbled initially, his reflexes honed for aggression, not subtlety. Riley adjusted his grip, shifted his stance, and silently corrected him without drawing attention. It was humiliating but effective. Observing finally admitted under his breath, "She's different, better." Nodded silently, wiping sweat from his brow. He had tried to challenge her once in the alley, and that lesson was still fresh. Now, under her instruction, he realized that respect was earned through skill and integrity, not threats or intimidation. Outside the training grounds, cadets whispered in small groups. Riley's influence was undeniable. She did not demand authority, she demonstrated excellence, and cadets followed voluntarily. Leadership without ego, skill without malice, discipline without cruelty. The academy staff observed the changes with quiet approval. Captain noted how cadets who had been reckless or overconfident now moved with intention. Mistakes still occurred, but fewer and further between. Riley's teaching had instilled awareness, anticipation, and respect for both rules and peers. By week's end, even Blake had begun to change, not entirely but subtly. They approached drills with careful consideration rather than blind bravado. They listened when Riley offered corrections, no longer scoffing or dismissing her. The shift was noticeable, even to cadets who had not witnessed the alley incident firsthand. One afternoon, during a tactical exercise, Riley stopped mid-session to address the entire field. Her voice was calm, steady, and commanding. "Cadets, strength is meaningless without control. Speed is useless without precision. Aggression without awareness is dangerous, not just to you but to everyone around you. Remember, discipline is earned through practice, patience, and respect for the rules and your peers." The cadets nodded silently, absorbing the lesson. Even those who had once laughed at her or ignored her guidance recognized the truth in her words. After drills, Riley returned to her bunk to review the day's observations. She noted improvements in technique, alignment, and reflexes. She also marked behavioral changes. Cadets who had been arrogant or impulsive were now more reflective, aware, and cooperative. Blake's quiet attentiveness, his restrained humor, his thoughtful observation, each represented progress, small but significant. That night, the dormitory was quieter than usual. Cadets discussed the day's lessons and practiced techniques quietly in their bunks or the small practice area near the courtyard. Riley had inspired a culture of self-improvement, one built on respect, skill, and discipline rather than fear. The alley incident, once a source of tension, had become a story whispered among cadets, not as a cautionary tale of confrontation, but as a lesson in humility and mastery. They spoke of Riley not as a mysterious freshman, but as someone who had transformed their understanding of skill, control, and leadership. Even Blake, previously the loudest and most aggressive cadet, approached Riley privately one evening. "Cadet Hart," he said, voice hesitant, I didn't understand before. I thought strength came from fear. You've shown me otherwise." Riley's expression softened slightly. "Strength without control is dangerous," she replied calmly. "It's never too late to learn, Cadet Spencer. The lesson is only effective if you apply it." Standing nearby, added quietly, "She's really teaching us, not just showing off." Nodded in agreement. "I didn't expect this. I thought she'd crush us for what we did. Instead, we're actually learning." Riley's influence extended beyond combat skills. She taught cadets situational awareness, mental discipline, and the importance of observation. She emphasized anticipation, patience, and decision-making under pressure, skills that would serve them in every aspect of academy life, and later, in military or civilian careers. By the end of the week, Military Academy was noticeably transformed. Cadets were more focused, drills were cleaner, mistakes were fewer, and the culture of intimidation had been replaced by mutual respect. Riley's quiet leadership had created an environment where skill and discipline mattered more than ego and aggression. Even Blake, who had once ruled the social hierarchy through fear, began to embrace the change. Their respect for Riley was genuine, not forced. They followed her guidance, applied her teachings, and began mentoring younger cadets under her supervision. Riley herself remained humble, never seeking praise or recognition. Her goal was simple: to instill discipline, respect, and mastery. She had arrived at the academy to escape her past, but she had found purpose in shaping its future. As night fell and cadets settled into their bunks, Riley reflected on the past weeks. The alley incident had been unexpected, but it had catalyzed a transformation. She had acted with discipline, not malice. She had demonstrated skill, not arrogance. And she had created a culture of respect that would endure long after her first year at Military Academy. For the first time, she allowed herself a quiet smile. She hadn't sought power or recognition. She had merely exercised control and discipline. And in doing so, she had changed an entire institution, one cadet at a time. The storm had passed. The academy had been transformed. And Riley Hart, the quiet new girl, had become an unshakable force of guidance, skill, and influence. The weeks had transformed Military Academy. The tension and arrogance that once defined the senior cadets had melted into a cautious, disciplined focus. Blake, and once the unchallenged rulers of the cadet hierarchy, had become students of skill, humility, and patience. Their grudging respect for Riley Hart had evolved into genuine acknowledgement of her mastery. But as with every institution built on hierarchy, a final test was inevitable. A rival group known for exploiting weakness, caught wind of the whispered tales about Riley's abilities. They saw her influence as a challenge to their authority. One chilly evening, they cornered her near the academy's training grounds, hoping to assert dominance and reclaim the narrative. Riley, who had anticipated this possibility, stood calmly under the pale moonlight. Her posture was relaxed but precise, every micro-shift of her weight signaling readiness. Blake, arrived just moments later, silently positioned beside her. This time they were no longer aggressors. They were allies, ready to support her guidance rather than undermine it. "Cadet Hart," the lead upperclassman sneered, "we've heard the stories. Let's see if you live up to them." Riley's eyes met his steadily. "This isn't about proving anything," she said evenly. "It's about understanding consequences." The upperclassman charged, overestimating his strength and underestimating her calm. Riley shifted her weight slightly, letting his momentum carry him forward. He stumbled, off balance, and almost fell to the ground before she guided him safely back upright. Gasps rippled through the assembled cadets. The maneuver was precise, controlled, and entirely nonviolent. She wasn't there to destroy, she was there to teach restraint and the importance of discipline. Blake and watched silently. They had once mocked this approach, but now they understood. Real authority came from control, not brute force. The upperclassman tried again, this time pulling a quick strike. Riley's reflexes, honed through years of SEAL training, intercepted effortlessly. With a subtle push and pivot, she redirected his energy away from herself and toward the empty ground, neutralizing his attack without harm. The remaining cadets froze. What they had assumed would be a chaotic brawl turned into a controlled demonstration of skill and strategy. Riley's presence transformed the confrontation into a lesson rather than a fight. "You see," she said softly, "aggression without awareness is dangerous. Control without discipline is meaningless. Power without respect is hollow." Blake, stepping forward beside her, added, "And assuming superiority can cost more than you realize." His voice was firm but devoid of arrogance, and nodded in agreement, silently reinforcing the point. They, witnessing their previously untouchable peers humbled and controlled, began to retreat. Their confidence crumbled as Riley maintained calm dominance, not through violence but through mastery of movement, awareness, and psychological control. By the end of the encounter, the rival group acknowledged defeat, not through surrender, but through recognition. They had underestimated a single cadet's capability and the combined discipline of those who now followed her lead. The night ended without injury, but the message was clear. Military Academy's culture had shifted irreversibly. Respect was no longer given by default. It was earned through discipline, mastery, and integrity. Riley Hart, the quiet new girl, had redefined what it meant to lead and command attention. In the following weeks, her informal lessons became institutionalized. The instructors incorporated her techniques into the Academy's official curriculum. Cadets practiced controlled engagement, anticipation, and mental discipline under her guidance. Mistakes still occurred, but they were treated as opportunities to learn, not chances to humiliate or dominate. Blake and became her apprentices in subtle ways, mentoring younger cadets under her supervision. Their growth was visible, not only in skill but in character. Arrogance had been replaced by careful thought. Aggression had been tempered by strategy. Ego had been replaced with understanding. The Academy itself thrived under this transformation. Cadets who had previously relied on intimidation now relied on technique. Leaders were chosen based on ability and respect, not fear or bullying. And Riley, though still humble and quiet, had become the axis around which this new culture revolved. One afternoon, Captain observed a training session from the balcony above the grounds. Cadets moved with precision, executing maneuvers Riley had taught weeks before. He smiled subtly, recognizing the long-term impact of her influence. The Academy had grown stronger, safer, and more disciplined under her guidance. Riley, meanwhile, stood apart from the main group, adjusting a cadet's stance or correcting posture quietly. She did not seek recognition. She did not seek applause. Her satisfaction came from knowing that discipline, control, and respect had taken root. The alley incident, once a moment of confrontation and shock, had become a cornerstone of the Academy's transformation. Cadets repeated the story, not as gossip, but as a lesson in humility, awareness, and the consequences of underestimating someone. Blake and often reflected on their initial arrogance. They had been wrong, but through Riley's guidance, they had learned something far more valuable than dominance. They had learned restraint, discipline, and the power of silent authority. Riley's SEAL background, once a secret partially revealed through her movements and composure, became an inspiration rather than a mystery. Cadets understood that her skill was earned, not inherited. Her authority was built on experience, training, and wisdom. As the Academy settled into night, Riley walked alone to the edge of the training grounds, looking at the horizon. The stars reflected off the fields, casting long shadows that reminded her of the challenges she had faced and the victories she had quietly achieved. She had arrived seeking peace, anonymity, and routine. Instead, she had forged respect, instilled discipline, and reshaped the culture of an entire institution. The final lesson was simple. Leadership was not about ego, strength, or intimidation. Leadership was about control, mastery, and the quiet ability to inspire change without force. And in that, Riley Hart had become legendary, not for violence or aggression, but for discipline, skill, and unwavering integrity. Military Academy would never forget the quiet girl who arrived one night, faced 7 cadets, and transformed their world forever. And Riley, she remained as ever calm, composed, and ready for the next challenge, unshaken, unyielding, and unforgettable.